Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today is Thursday, so it's one of our commentary days. Rather than doing a review, I'm just going to talk about a topic, a gaming topic that I've been thinking a lot about. And I don't come into this with a script. I don't have anything in particular that I have already written down and want to say. Instead, I'm just going to muse for a while and think out loud about the concept of character death in RPGs. Because I'm very torn on the subject, and I haven't written something out in advance, partly because I don't know exactly what I want to say. I am torn on the subject of character death because in a typical role playing game, on one hand, I find death to be narratively boring. And that sounds weird coming from a horror author because, yes, death can be very valuable as a narrative tool. But usually, that doesn't apply to the main characters, right? That's not the protagonist of your story. Um, it is, the sidekick or the neighbor or, another victim of a monster that we have to pursue. And yes, sometimes important characters can die, but it has to matter. Death has to matter in order to be interesting. And if you just are trying to tell a story about a character or with a character, and then partway through that character rolls very poorly and dies before your story is over, well, that's disappointing to everybody. Um, and so I don't like it. There are many ways in which I consider a character dying during a role playing game to be a failure on my part as the game master. Now, on the other hand, I recognize that in a game environment, death is a vital part of the plausibility and reality of the game and the story that you're telling. Not because death has to happen, but because death has to be a possibility. If it's not, and if the players realize that you are going to start fudging rolls or doing certain things in order to keep them alive, well, then their sense of caution and propriety and strategy goes out the window completely because they know they can get away with increasingly more ridiculous things. Now, I'm not saying that every group of gamers out there is, a group of chained up hedonists just champing at the bit to be let loose and start breaking rules. That is not true. That's certainly true of some. But every group, even the ones who are most dedicated to plausibility and realism in their games, they are still going to react, consciously or not, to the way the game master handles death and protects them from consequences. And if there are no consequences to certain actions, then your characters are going to start taking those actions more often and more liberally. And you can see this in the real world as well. If somebody, commits a crime and then there is no consequence for that, they're going to do it again. If you're trying to raise a child and that child, doesn't receive any consequences for, the infractions that they do, if they draw on the wall or something like that and they don't get in trouble for it, then they know that it's okay to draw on the wall and they will do it again. It is our nature as humans to push envelopes and to probe limits. And so these are the two sides of the death question, right? I have to let my players know that it's a possibility because otherwise the characters will do increasingly ridiculous and dangerous things. But at the same time, I don't want it to happen until I want it to happen because that is the value of storytelling. Now, there are a lot of games, and in fact, some of my very favorite games, where character death is a part of the game. I talked yesterday about, or 2 days ago, about Pendragon. And Pendragon is one of my all-time favorites RPGs, top two easily, and it involves character death as a natural part of the game, not just a consequence of poor decision making or of bad rolling, but as a fact of life. The Great Pendragon campaign takes 80 years, and part of the joy, part of the appeal of the game, is that the knight you start off with will eventually grow old. He will die in battle, or he will die in his bed, and maybe die in somebody else's bed. Eventually, he or she will be dead, and that character's child will take over. And so you're not really playing a single character, you are playing a family, a bloodline. In general, bloodline games, that is my own term, are some of my very favorite games in the world. Give me the chance to build a family legacy over time, and I am in heaven. There's a card game called Among Us, or no, Among Nobles. Sorry, got Among Us on the brain. A card game called Among Nobles that was kickstarted a few years ago that does a really great job with this. One of my favorite board games of all time is called Legacy, The Testament of Duke de Crecy, which is another just absolutely phenomenal bloodline game. Pendragon does this. The One Ring does this. Games where you get to build a family over time, and one generation rises up and does great things and then passes the torch to the next generation. I love this, and death is a natural part of it. But there's still, even in that situation, is this tricky gray area where you're like, well, it takes, in Pendragon, for example, 21 years for a child to grow and come of age. That means that in ideal circumstances, the first generation will be alive for at least 21 years, right? And then they will die, and then the new generation will take over. But depending on when that happens, it changes everything. Pendragon as a game can be very, very dangerous. It can be very brutal. Combat, excuse me. Pendragon as a game can be very deadly. It's very easy for characters to die. And so if somebody dies, early on. First time I played Pendragon, my character died in the first year. Final battle, end of the first year, dead. And that is, that's relatively fine because you just start over with a new character the next year and you're just 1 year behind everybody else. That's no big deal. What if you die 10 years in? And your child, assuming you had one in the very first year, your kid is still 11 years away from taking over, maybe 12. And so then you've got to play as a brother or something, which is still part of the same family line. And I totally see where that is. But at the same time, I was looking forward to passing the torch on to my son, and now I don't get to do it because I died 10 years in, and he's got 10, 11, 12 years left before he gets to take over. So, on the other hand, what if your character manages to live too long? What if your character is old? An old woman, with her armor that she's worn in countless battles and her sword that she's carried, and she's, lived so long she's outlived several horses, and then at the twilight of her life she finally dies of old age, and you've got like a fully middle-aged child who's already presumably gone on and had their own career and done a bunch of other things. And so it's less of, you're not exactly handing down that torch at the start of that character's adventuring life. They're just kind of sighing and taking over more responsibilities because they've already shouldered some a long time ago. And none of these situations are inherently bad. They're just tricky to navigate. And they go back to my original point that I was making about how character death in games needs to matter and it needs to be important, but also I feel it needs to come at the right time. Um, if you're playing now, one of the things we're seeing a lot in modern RPG industry is the return of what I'll call old school games. Stuff like Forbidden Lands, Hexcrawl, games like that. Those games are very interesting in that they don't really have a long story that they are trying to tell. They follow what is called emergent story, where you put the players into an environment, you give them a bunch of tools, maybe to the point of a fully sandbox game. And then they get to run around and they get to use those tools and play with those toys however they want. And a story will naturally emerge from it. This is a lot of how role-playing games were played back in the day, back in the 70s and 80s when I got started. Was kind of just when stories had become a little more codified and a little more structured. And so things like, if you're going to play through the Great Pendragon campaign, or the Enemy Within campaign, or the Mask of Nyarlathotep in Call of Cthulhu, there's, these big, famous, long-form stories that are very different from what role-playing games used to be. I was on a panel once at a convention with Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. It was the two of them and me, and I want to say Paul Janess, and one other person, I can't remember who it was. But it was the panel was about role-playing campaigns. And we were talking, and we realized about 10-15 minutes into the game that some of the confusion and some of the weird answers that we were getting as the panel talked to each other were because of a generational gap in understanding, or in definition, I guess is a better way of phrasing this. Margaret and Tracy were defining campaign as the setting, the world in which a story takes place. And Paul and I, and this other person who I can't remember, we were defining campaign as the story that is being told. Now, you look at something like The Curse of Strahd, originally written by Margaret and Tracy, as the Castle Ravenloft campaign. And that bridges that gap really well. There is absolutely a story, but the campaign module, the book that you buy and that you use in order to run the game, doesn't lay a story out for you. It merely presents you with a world and with some unique quirks of the setting, and then a map full of locations and people. And those people have backstories, and they have desires, and they have plans. And then your job as the game master is to kind of keep in mind, well, this is going on and this is going on, and then let the players interact with that however they want. And a story will emerge, but it's not fully to the point of emergent storytelling, because you've got powerful characters like Strahd who are going to be imposing their will onto the story the whole time. It is not a generic hex crawl. It is the characters are navigating what you could almost define as somebody else's story. The point that I'm slowly working my way around to here is that in a hex crawl game, in an old school gaming, classical campaign setting kind of game, death serves a different function, I feel. And in many ways, the way that our role-playing culture has grown up, death works better in those old school games, because the characters are a little more in control of what's happening. They have, the players are the ones who choose, well, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to click this thing, I'm going to push this button, I am going to antagonize this enemy, I'm going to try to solve this problem. And because they're the ones in control of what is happening when, then if they bite off more than they can chew, they die. If they go exploring where they shouldn't, and they roll too many random encounters, they die. Random encounters and character death and things like that are a valuable railing system, not because they control what the characters can do, but because they provide consequences to the choices the characters make. Now you compare that to a different kind of campaign where it is much more focused on a story that is being told instead of a setting that is being explored. And at that point, when and how the characters die can be much more disruptive and feel much more punitive. And that is partly because the entire concept of character death is still based on that old school model of, well, you're the one who decided to go and visit the bone grinder mill in the first place, so it's your fault that you got eaten by witches. Sorry. And I'm trying to think of a good modern analog to that. The Enemy Within. It isn't even a modern campaign. It's from the 80s. But it does have a single linear story. It is not a railroad, but there is a very specific sequence of events, and that makes it very different from a Ravenloft campaign. And that also makes it so that character death doesn't feel like it fits as well, which is a strange thing to say about such a violent game. For example, the way that the Enemy Within campaign starts, pretty much the inciting incident of it, is that the characters find a crashed carriage on the side of the road in a forest and realize that one of those people dead on the scene is an absolute doppelganger for one of the PCs. They could be twins. They are physically very, very similar to each other. And then they also realize, oh my gosh, that dude has got the deed of a manor house in his pocket. He is important. And we can take that deed, go to that town, claim to be him, and now we've got wealth beyond our wildest dreams. And that's not really a spoiler. That's the first or second scene of the entire campaign, and it's what kicks it all off. What happens if that guy dies? You have given him this enormous suit of plot armor, because now you as the game master know that if that character dies before you get to Bogenhofen, or even while you're in Bogenhofen, then everything changes. The campaign technically can still work, but not as well. And lots of pieces of it are going to fall apart. And lots of character motivations, lots of NPC decisions are no longer going to make as much sense if that character dies. And if the player realizes that they're wearing this beautiful suit of plot armor, then that can cause even more problems. And so how do you as a game master decide how to handle that situation? How are you going to go through? I don't think that the right answer is to stop telling big stories. I obviously don't. Something like the Enemy Within campaign is one of the greatest role-playing campaigns of all time. I've run it twice. And yes, in both cases, I did kind of have to fudge a roll here and there to make sure that the right character didn't die at the wrong time. One thing you can do, and what a lot of game masters do, is just make sure that the danger of the world and the danger of each situation is fully established. Make sure that they know how fragile they are. And if that means that you need to kill off a different character who isn't as vital to the narrative just to make your point, maybe that's okay, or maybe that's hilariously unfair. If you kill off an NPC, well, you kill off NPCs all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean much of anything. But I do believe that more than anything else, this idea of establishing stakes and of demonstrating consequences is the way to, kind of put bumpers in the gutter so that your characters know, your players know more directly what kind of a game you're running. They know that this is going to be dangerous, that death is a possibility, and then they will do what they can to avoid it. Now that we've talked so much about death, let's take another look at D&D 5, in which player character death is almost impossible. I mean, it's not, but in my experience running D&D 5, and I am currently running 4 different campaigns concurrently in D&D 5, player death never happens. It is very, very hard. And what I have seen in other games that other people run is that the only time a character dies, like permanently dies, is because the game master is doing it on purpose. It is the most forgiving game of character death that I have ever seen. The way, and I've talked about this before when I talked about balancing encounters, putting up a challenge that will threaten your PCs really requires a multi-session dungeon with a bunch of fights in it. Or it requires a ridiculously overpowered enemy who can start one-shotting people. And once you get to that point and somebody finally drops, they hit 0 hit points, then they've got to make those death saves. And that's basically you just roll a d20. If you get under a 10, you fail. If you get over a 10, you pass. And I think it's 1 through 10 and 11 through 20. So under or equal to or less than 10 is a fail. Over 10 is a pass. If you fail 3 of those rolls before you make 3 of those rolls, you die. But again, all it takes is a single hit point to stabilize somebody. And so the paladin, I've got one group where the paladin will always hold back 1 lay on hands point as the magical, death ticket, the get out of death free card. You've got healing potions, you've got spells, you've got all of these miraculous ways to, even if somebody is sitting there dying, you can jump in and save them. Now, 5e does say that if you roll a 1, that counts as 2 fails on a death save instead of 1. Every time a downed character who is rolling death saves gets damaged, that also counts as a fail. But again, that goes back to the point of the GM has to be doing this on purpose, right? Either a little goblin runs up and starts stabbing your unconscious body, in which case the game master is just being a jerk. Or the body gets caught in the area effect spell of somebody else. Somebody casts Burning Hands on your friend, and you happen to be caught in the corner of it, and that damages you. And then after you hit about level 5, let's say, 5 or 6, you're never going to die. It's just never going to happen. And so, to that extent, death in RPGs, I think, comes too rarely. Which is a weird thing to say because I'm the one who started this off by saying that death happened too often, and I thought death was boring. I have set out in some of my campaigns specifically trying to kill characters just to see if I could do it in D&D 5. And maybe it's just the way that I play. But yeah, every time I've done that, I've been sitting in the point where I realize I either have to admit that my goal is to kill a character because the monster is going to pause in their destruction to punch an unconscious body. Or I have to just let this take its course and let the other characters save them. I have many fights where characters drop to 0. I've never seen a character die in 5e. And I'm starting to worry about that. The new campaign that I am starting next month on Typecast RPG is called Arok. It's a Stone Age thing, and I'm actually going to be incorporating a lot of these ideas. That is probably why I wanted to talk about this topic today, because I'm hoping to do a bit of a generational Bloodline thing, which means that I'm hoping that characters will die. Because I do want this sense of time and progress. And that means that I've been thinking about 5e and the possibility of actually killing characters in it. And I'm going to have to make the world pretty dangerous, and I am going to have to be very, very strict with combat and positioning and everything else in order to get to this point where characters die. It's going to be an interesting experiment because I don't want to set out to murder characters pointlessly, but I do want death to be not only a possibility, but an occurrence. I would like to see some deaths because I want to try this generational idea. At the same time, Typecast is a campaign that I run where all of the players are writers, fantasy and science fiction authors, and Courtney is a horror author, like I am. And so we care a lot about the stories that are being told, and we try to build in really interesting character arcs. And so one thing that I have seen in other games that I might try to adopt into D&D is the ability to self-sacrifice in order to achieve something, or some kind of loss of plot armor, and maybe the answer is to code the plot armor directly into the game system a little bit and say, once you have achieved this goal, every character sets a goal, and once they've achieved it, then things are more difficult. They can die more easily. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I wish that I had some better answers about this. It is coming from the background of a horror author, someone who writes horror novels. I understand the power of character death. There's one of my books where the death is so powerful that if somebody online or in a convention says, "Oh, you're Dan Wells, I hate you," then I know exactly which page of which book they just read. And it's because the ability of a storyteller to get your audience invested in something so much that you scream or cry or throw the book when a character dies, that's gold. That is happiness. That is my win condition. Doing that in a role-playing game is so much more difficult because it is an interactive system. Because it's not just you telling a story, it is a whole group of people telling a story. And everyone in that group has ownership of it. And if everybody agrees, if everyone who's got a stake in it says, yes, the best way to tell this story right now is for this character to die, then that works. But how often does that happen? How often does a character in a D&D game, how often does a player say, you know what? My character really needs to fail this and really needs to die right now. It definitely does happen. But it is rare. And so maybe the answer that I'm looking for of how to handle character death correctly is just to, A, establish stakes so that if it happens in a fight, it's your own fault. And B, put it into player control. Give them the chance to earn something with their death. That idea of a glorious, noble self-sacrifice. That they are going to die defending someone or saving someone. Maybe that's as simple as giving each player character a little chip and say, you can cash this in at any time to succeed at something astronomically impossible at the risk of your own life, or at the expense of your own life. Maybe that's the way to handle it. I don't know. I will continue mulling over this question for a while. How and when is the best way to kill a character in a role-playing game? How do you handle that? How do you make it matter? Because like I said at the beginning, if it doesn't matter, if it isn't important, then there's no point in doing it at all. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I am Dan Wells. I am, as mentioned, a horror author. My most famous series is called I Am Not a Serial Killer. It's been made into a movie starring Christopher Lloyd, which you can find, on Amazon Prime and other fine streaming networks. For a while, the D&D was in stores too, but I don't know if it still is because it's a few years old now. Anyway, I have 18 books in print and another one coming next week, and they're all awesome, and you should go and listen to them all. I also do 2 Twitch actual play campaigns on Typecast RPG is our Twitch channel. Every Tuesday, we have a D&D campaign called The Gods of Veyron, although very soon, like I said, that's switching to our new campaign. And then every other Wednesday is a Star Trek Adventures campaign called Star Trek Horizon, about a science ship on the fringes of Federation space. And they're both fantastic, and I really love the players that I get to work with, and all the good friends that we have and the good times that we have. So please come and watch our show. Please go out and buy all my books, and I will see you next time. Thank you. I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.